How is letter V pronounced in Latin? I'm going to tell you about that today. My name is Luke, and this is polýMATHY. Now, there are different standards of pronunciation for Latin, and one with which a lot of people are familiar is the ecclesiastical or scholastic Italian pronunciation of Latin, the traditional pronunciation of Latin in Italy for many hundreds of years. And I've talked about in this video the origins of the ecclesiastical pronunciation, why indeed it's not actually a good representation of the pronunciation of ancient Latin, but I want to affirm is an outstanding convention, and that any of you out there who enjoy using the ecclesiastical pronunciation convention of Latin should continue to feel free to do so. But when it comes to ancient Latin, many people are interested in the classical pronunciation of Latin. Classical Latin is a literary period from about 100 BC to 200 AD. And that 300-year period, those 3 centuries, make up what we consider to be classical Latin literature. And that's when great authors like Tacitus, Suetonius, Cicero, Apuleius, and Caesar all were living and writing. And so, often when we speak Latin today, we're very interested in imitating the pronunciation from that time period. And you may know that the restored classical pronunciation of Latin designates that the letter V ought to be pronounced just as the letter W in English. Well, how accurate is that? Does that pronunciation represent all speakers in that time period? Well, let's find out. Practically speaking, the short answer to this question, should it in fact be a W sound, is yes. And the way we know that is that we even have a word in modern English that is from Latin which still has that sound. Wine. Wine comes into English from older forms of English and Germanic languages, such as Gothic, which borrowed the Latin word vīnum, which means wine. Modern German, of course, has the word Wein. Interestingly, modern German demonstrates a similar change of W to V, just as many Romance languages do, although English, by exception, doesn't have that change. And yet, very curiously, both German and English had the same vowel change of a long E into I in this word, wine, vine, both from Latin, vīnum. That said, there are many speakers of Romance languages who, when they interact with reciting or speaking Latin, they don't necessarily believe fully that the sound of the V in Latin could have been a W sound, a W sound as in English, because it seems so foreign to them. It seems so much like English. Why wouldn't it be a V, like French or Portuguese or Italian? Can't forget Romanian. Spanish, of course, somewhat different from Portuguese, French, Italian, and Romanian, has a merger of the letter B and the letter V, such that the letter B and the letter V in most varieties of Spanish actually are just one letter. They look different for etymological reasons, or for spelling convention reasons only. But they do have 2 allophonic sounds. An allophone is a different sound a letter or a phoneme might make in a different environment. When the letter B or the letter V starts a phrase, that is, after a pause in Spanish, it's a B sound. But when it's between vowels, it will become a voiced bilabial approximate, that is a V sound, V. And also sometimes it can be realized more like a bilabial fricative, V. One example could be the word for 20 in Spanish, which is 20. But if we say 220, we put that letter V between vowels. And now it's a 20. And like I mentioned, the letter V and the letter B represent the exact same sound, so that buena just means good, and that starts with a B. But if I say la buena casa, then that B becomes the voiced bilabial approximate or fricative sound. But that being said, not a single Romance language has the W sound of English, right? Actually, I can tell you 2 Romance languages that do have the W sound. First, Corsican. The Corsican language is closely related to other dialects or languages of Italy. Corsican has a fascinating phonology, especially when it comes to the letter B and the letter V. These behave very similarly to how they do in Spanish. That is, if a letter B or letter V starts an utterance, starts a phrase, then it will have that B sound. But when it's between vowels, intervocalically, either internal to a word or between vowels within the phrase, that letter B or letter V will sound exactly like English W. For example,
Un saluto che la ďuištan ku troppo.
la ďuistu. So some sort of vowel, a vistu, instead of visto. This is very much like Spanish, where visto would be sounded like that after a pause, but with he visto, it becomes a bilabial fricative or some kind of bilabial approximate sound. In Corsican, however, that exact same bilabial fricative or voiced bilabial approximate sound of Spanish instead is actually the voiced bilabial velar approximate, which is the English W sound.
E poi,
In this example, which means and you, we hear e boy. And I'm sure you would say, but Luke, you just said that in Corsican, the letter V between vowels should be a W. Well, here what we have is the phenomenon of raddoppiamento fonosintattico, about which my friend and colleague Davide Gemello has spoken about extensively and wonderfully on his channel Podcast Italiano. In this environment, the initial letter V sound is here geminated. And if it's geminated, that means there's two of the sound. So it's not between vowels because there's two of them. So that makes it e boy instead of e voi or something. But not just Corsican. On the peninsula of Italy, we can also find another Romance language, which uses a W sound in even more positions. And that language is Montellese, which is found in Campania. Let's listen to some words from Montellese.
9. Quindi, verde, giovane, vivo, vacca, uovo, vino, bestia, buono.
So unlike Corsican and Spanish, the letter B and the letter V, inherited from Latin, have not completely merged to be two letters for the same phoneme with allophonic variation. Instead, we see that the Latin V is consistently the English W sound at beginning of words, like the word for green, verde, as well as intervocalically, like nove. And remember how wine is how we pronounce it in English, of course, with that W sound, vīno, in Montellese. Very, very similar to what the ancient Latin sound must also have been. But similar to Corsican and Spanish, Montellese also demonstrates that the letter B, when between vowels or in the middle of the word somewhere, it can change into the exact same sound as the V, even when it's initial. That is a W sound. Interestingly, the diphthongization of short O into wo, which we see from the vulgar Latin ovum. It was ovum, a long O, in the standard form of urban Roman Latin, which we associate with classical Latin. But in a different variety of Latin, which became Italian, we see that there was a short O, which is why it's wo in the beginning of that word, hence uovo in Montellese, uovo. So the sound of wa, which only occurs normally in the diphthong Italian wo, such as uovo, uomo in standard Italian, it's still there, and it's essentially the exact same sound as we have with the letter V that's between vowels in Montellese. So Montellese still has a contrast between the letter V and the letter B, although sometimes they merge intervocalically to become the same sound. Does this demonstrate the sound of an earlier form of Romance, an earlier form, or even a later form perhaps, of Latin? It absolutely could. So the fact that there are at least two Romance languages, as well as, by the way, certain accents in Lazio, that is Latium, the region around Rome, where this sound occurs rather frequently, that means that the notion that the sound of w in classical Latin restored pronunciation as being somehow unfit for Latin because it's not found in, say, Spanish or Portuguese or French or Standard Italian, can't forget Romanian, doesn't really carry water. But it doesn't mean that Montellese is necessarily demonstrating a phonetic stage in the evolution of these sounds. Evolutionary stage, I mean, because we can see how we get the V sound in Standard Italian and many other Romance languages. But it could. Another possibility is that they did merge into something more like a V and then went backwards into the W. I don't think that's necessarily very likely, but I'm definitely not going to say that the exact sounds we hear in Montellese are a perfect representation of the general ancient voice of Latin. And as for that ancient voice, we have Roman grammarians who extensively talk about, during the classical period, the fact that the sound of the consonant U letter, which we represent standard as V, is simply the consonant version of the U, that it makes a W sound. And we can see this morphologically. The word wine, vīnum in Latin, is cognate with Greek ýoўnos. And ýoўnos used to have a digamma in front of it. That is to say, it started in a more archaic version of the language with a W sound. And some dialects of Greek would use the digamma to represent W. So, for example, Homeric Greek had vīnos instead of ýoўnos. But in Attic Greek, the prestige dialect during the classical period, which is the foundation of Koine Greek, the sound of the digamma, the W, was completely dropped. We can see it in another cognate. The word for I saw in ancient Greek is ἰδων, and this is cognate with Latin vidi. In fact, ΙΔων used to start with the consonant sound of W, the digamma, βίδων or βέδων. So the original archaic sound of the letter that we write as V today in standard Latin orthography definitely represented the W, the W sound, in an archaic period. Did it in classical Latin as well? Absolutely. However, we start to see some really interesting things in the 1st century AD. We have Pompeian inscriptions dated exactly to the 15th of September, the year 39, where we see spelled like this, Iobe, the ablative form of the word for Jupiter, and DB. Now, what does this mean? Does this mean that it was actually pronounced like ba? Almost certainly not. What's occurring here is a demonstration that whatever the sound that the letter V is supposed to make is close enough to the sound that the letter B makes for this author to write it like this. And when we look at Montellese and we see that the letter B is totally merged with the sound of W, just as it is in Corsican, it could mean that for this group of speakers, or even for many speakers, the sound of the B between vowels had gone from B lenited to something more like a fricative, like a V, and then even perhaps become an approximate V, or even W, such that when the person was writing ģiūs, they knew that the letter B between vowels is a W, and then they would write it in exactly that manner. That's one explanation. Another explanation is that the sound of W was getting some kind of fricative pronunciation, that it was becoming the bilabial fricative V, allowing the merger to take place. And we see more and more examples of this, starting from the 1st century AD, and then the wonderful grammarian Velleius Longus, who may have even called himself Velleius, he talks about in the 2nd century AD, that is the final century of what we consider to be classical Latin literature, he talks about there being a degree of aspiration in the pronunciation of the letter V. And aspiration isn't how we would call it today. We would describe it as a fricative sound. But this seems to suggest that he's recommending V or something like that instead of merely W. And then we have late Latin grammarians that say using the W sound for the letter V is a barbarism characteristic of Greek speakers. Now, Greek also had the change of the letter beta into, in modern Greek, it's pronounced vita. It's a labiodental fricative, V. But during this Roman classical period, it almost certainly was becoming V, a bilabial fricative, which is how I pronounce it in the Lucian pronunciation. So since Greek already had a fricative type sound, which was quite similar, why would they use an old W sound? Well, I have an idea about that, which I haven't fully researched, but I'm a big fan of the author Apuleius, and he wrote the oldest complete surviving novel called Metamorphoses, or The Golden Ass. And in it, he seems to depict rustic Greeks speaking Latin using several archaic forms of Latin. Now, there's many reasons the author could have chosen to do this, but one theory I have is that since Greek was assimilated into the Roman Republic before the classical period, there would be likely several more archaic features in the language. That is, they would have absorbed certain expressions, idioms, and even pronunciations, which could have even lasted hundreds of years, that would simply change and go away in Italy and other parts of the Roman Empire. Similarly, for example, the American English dialect, we use a strong R sound at the ends of words. And this is typical of an older pronunciation of English in England, even though many British dialects are non-rhotic, as I talked about in the rho video. For example, I say father, a Brit would normally say father. Not all, of course. There are many different dialects in England, but that's the best known pronunciation, perhaps, from England today. So I can't prove that about the Greek doing a w instead of a v or a v or some other sound as being necessarily evidence of that kind of archaism, but I see tantalizing pieces of evidence which might warrant further research. Really fascinating to me is that ancient Greek was changing the sound of its letter beta, eventually into modern vita, with this transitional sound of a v, a bilabial fricative almost certainly, at the exact same time something like that was happening in Latin. So which came first? Could it have been some kind of a Sprachbund, a bound language area where it started in one language first and then was passed to the other? Did it start first in Greek and then influence Latin, or vice versa? For example, the sound of the R in French and German is a r or a r sound. And this sound is somewhat unusual because so many other languages usually have a trilled r sound. So where did this come from? Well, there are two theories. One theory is that it actually started in the erudite form of French in the 17th century, and then was adopted by influence, merely by contact, into German, Danish, and even Portuguese. Another theory is, in fact, it started in some dialect of German and then was passed on to French and other languages. But both theories do have the idea that a certain sound started in a language group and then was transferred to a rather different language group, Germanic and Romance, respectively. And this could easily have happened between two somewhat closely related, but definitely not the same language, which are Greek and Latin, simply because of the constant contact in the Mediterranean of Greek and Latin speakers. Or maybe they just coincidentally developed at the exact same time, which was the 1st century AD, for both languages changing their sound of b. So this means that the normal pronunciation in the restored version of classical Latin, which we do as w, like vīnum, is absolutely legitimate, even to a later period. Yet we can find plenty of speakers who are changing their pronunciation. And that pronunciation was demonstrating a merger, a somewhat gradual merger, of the intervocalic b and the letter v. And to hear a really cool example of what this might have sounded like when the merger was beginning to occur in native speakers, I recommend my friend Stefano Vittori's channel. And there Stefano does a fabulous dramatic reading of Petronius, where he continues to distinguish the letter V from the letter B, but he makes both sound a little bit more like the other. He adds a degree of lenition to the intervocalic B. So habere, to have, classical Latin pronunciation standard. Instead he does habere, habere. It's a little bit more like an approximant or a fricative. While for the letter V, he compresses it. So instead of verum, he says verum, verum. So you'll say habere and verum. They're a little bit different. They still can be distinguished, but darn, they are very much closer than they were before. And I love this. In fact, I do this sometimes in my classical Latin recordings because I find it gives a little bit of feeling of authenticity to what the real natural sound might have been. I don't always do it, but I do like it. In fact, some people have said they've heard it in some of my songs. I'm like, yes, I know, it's not wrong. I'm doing it deliberately. So that means if we want to speak Latin with a restored classical pronunciation, clearly distinguishing w from b, that's fine. But it doesn't seem to make much sense to use b and v, and to say that's absolutely a historical representation of the language. So it definitely seems vanishingly unlikely that we would have a normal intervocalic b sound like in habere, but also have the letter v pronounced as a true v, a labiodental fricative, because all the evidence shows that those two sounds intervocalically were going towards a merger, or had completely merged. Absolutely, they completely merged by the time we have a v, a true v sound in later Latin and early Romance. There is this complex change. When the sounds were clearly distinguished with a w and a b intervocalically, well, we'd have to use w and b. Or we could do what Stefano Vittori does, which gives us more of a 1st century AD sound, of starting to compress the w and then to lenit the intervocalic ba, like avere, Or we could fully merge the two sounds together, something like Spanish or Montellese or Corsican. Those would all be, I think, good representations of the sound of Latin as it's changing through the centuries. If you want to learn more about how ancient w has changed into va and other sounds in different languages, I can recommend two videos and two really great channels. First, the wonderful Jackson Crawford recently discussed this topic with regard to Old Norse, how the sound of what is written as v, how it was a w, how it changed to va, but even how it remains a w in certain isolated dialects of modern Nordic languages. Definitely subscribe to Jackson Crawford, he's the best. And on the exact sounds of Spanish and how to realize them, go to Linguriosa, where she talks about, in Spanish, great videos by the way, exactly this sound. And the links to both of those videos are in the description. Finally, people are usually annoyed by the idea that classical Latin would have a w because of the famous Caesarean phrase, I came, I saw, I conquered. Often they've heard it first in that ecclesiastical pronunciation, veni, vidi, vici. It sounds absolutely cool, just like everything in ecclesiastical pronunciation. And then they go, it's not going to be wanny, weedy, winky. I know, well, if you say it like that, of course it sounds terrible. But there are many languages which can sound just as strong or sweet or rough or dulcet as you like, and they have a w sound. So instead of saying wanny, weedy, weaky, we say wanny, weedy, weaky. Then it sounds perfectly strong and tough and Caesarean, doesn't it? Just like most sounds in a language that seem strange at first, once you get used to them, they have all the same power and expressive potential as pretty much anything. So wanny, weedy, weaky can sound perfectly strong and gruff and rough, just like any sound in a foreign language that sounds strange to us at first. Once we get used to it, we don't really notice it that way anymore. What other sounds in the transformation of Latin and ancient Greek into their modern variants do you want to hear about next? Write a comment in the description. Thanks so much for watching. Valete. It's absolutely fine to use ecclesiastical, like I said before, it's absolutely fine to use ecclesiastical, its sound of the letter beta at the exact same time,